Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about intermittent fasting and your gains. Now, this is one of these topics that people always bring up. They treat it like it's a magical tool, and I want to make this clear up front. I do not disagree with intermittent fasting as a fat loss tool, a weight loss tool, or in some cases, a weight management tool. So I want to make that very, very clear. I know many people who utilize it. I know people who make it work successfully, particularly in a fat loss phase. And I know people who incorporate it successfully into their lifestyle pretty much year round. So I don't want people to think that I am saying it is a useless tool or a bad tool for specific goals. But I also want people to understand that other than a few quacks, even most nutrition researchers, experts, medical doctors do not think any of these magical health benefits exist for it outside of the context of its caloric management. Now, for some people, and what people need to remember, it's not a magical cure, it's not a fix-all. For some people, they find intermittent fasting to be an almost amazing tool for controlling their caloric intake. I know people personally who utilize it for that, and it's probably the best tool they have ever added to their arsenal. Right? It's the best tool in their toolbox for this. It works extremely well for them for this. All right. Other people, it doesn't work. Other people, it tends to sometimes cause them to binge even more later in the day, depending on how they do it. So it is a tool that its mileage will vary. For some people, it's phenomenal. And I mean phenomenal, like life-changing as far as a weight management or fat loss tool. Other people find it completely useless and even counterproductive. So it is just one of those tools that's going to vary depending upon the person, your personality type, your eating habits. So the reality is that it's somewhere in between those two because it depends upon the person. But here's the thing. When it comes to gaining any sort of muscle, and that could potentially apply towards recomposition. And I'm talking recomposition for people who are completely natural. All right. Recomposition is a little bit different of a beast when people start adding pharmaceuticals and anabolic substances. All right. Things can get changed very, very quickly there. And I know plenty of people who recomp very successfully on gear using intermittent fasting. I know quite a few. But even some of them run into the same problems. And even then, you have to remember that they're using anabolics to offset the negatives of it. Because what we have to remember when we're talking about gaining muscle or we're talking about even recomposition, we have to stimulate as much muscle growth as possible. And not just stimulate in the training sense, we have to create the nutritional and hormonal environment for that. So what does that mean? That means ideally, other than maybe when you're sleeping, you probably don't want to go more than 4 or 5 hours without consuming some protein, at least a reasonable amount. And what we know as far as optimal protein intakes, they actually vary. That's never been pinned down even by sports nutritionists. It's somewhere around the range for most people, depending on lifestyle, protein sources, digestion, all this other stuff, somewhere in the range of 4 or 5 feedings a day, assuming each of those feedings reaches like your minimum anabolic threshold for protein, which again, mileage may vary. And I'm going to suggest that for most people who train hard, it's 40 plus grams. Again, depending upon your body weight, muscle mass, all these other factors. So we're talking about really in an ideal world. In an ideal world, your protein feeding should be something in the range of at least 40 grams of protein in at least 4 feedings. And again, I understand that's a very blanket statement. I'm saying that's a starting point. That's a starting point. Mine is dramatically higher than that. Like, I'll be honest with you guys, I don't ever consume less than 250 grams of protein a day. But that's its own topic. That's me. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing for my own recomp. I occasionally might fast a little bit, but it's not really intentional. It's just on some of my non-training days, I get busy and I wait to eat breakfast a little bit. I might not eat breakfast till 10 a.m., maybe not even noon. And then I have a big protein feeding, but that's on off days. On training days, I would never train fasted. I get up and eat at 5 in the morning. I also eat a big meal immediately post-workout. I make sure I get at least 50 grams of protein in first thing in the morning. if not more. I make sure I get 70 to 100 grams of protein post-workout. So this is what we're looking at. It has to do with protein feedings. And the problem we have with intermittent fasting is that your total uptime of muscle protein synthesis from protein feedings is not ideal. And if we're trying to gain muscle mass and we're putting in all this training programming and trying to find optimal training programming, I'm not saying we need to have optimal nutrition, because we don't. It's actually not necessary to have optimal nutrition to gain pretty much maximum muscle. But you need to have pretty good nutrition. It needs to be reasonably on point. And if you have something as glaring as having 16-hour windows every day or frequently where you are intaking no protein, or at least not enough protein to even reach your anabolic threshold, because 10 grams of protein spread out through there or 20 grams of protein isn't going to cut it either. You are dramatically shortchanging your daily muscle protein synthesis time. And please note, I'm not telling you guys that you need to slam a protein shake every 2 hours or any of this nonsense. I'm not telling you you need 6, 8, 10 feedings a day, but you need at least 4 big feedings, and they need to be spaced out. They need to be spaced out. Because at the end of the day, if you are trying to maximize your growth windows and the growth that you're getting off of your training, what's the point of trying to maximize training stimulus if you're not doing that? Because we also have to deal with the fatigue end, the recovery end, everything else. Right? If you're trying to train fasted, that's going to be a problem. If you're not getting enough protein immediately after, that's a problem. If you are going to bed asleep without having a reasonable amino acid pull in your system, that's a problem if you are trying to gain muscle. And let's talk about it from a recomposition perspective. If we're trying to recomposition, we're staying at roughly the same body weight, and that's not set in stone. It could be a slow cut or a clean bulk in some cases. Like the scale could be trickling slowly, very, very slowly up or down. But you're close to maintenance on a weekly basis, a weekly maintenance. If you are stimulating due to, again, muscle protein synthesis uptime, if you are gaining slightly less muscle on the same caloric intake, you're also losing slightly less fat. Right? What are we looking for in terms of recomposition? If you are attempting to recomposition, you should be training with training loads and volumes that are nearly optimal. Right? You have to stay within your maximum recoverable volume, but if you're attempting to recomp, you probably need to be pretty high on your volume threshold in terms of what you can recover from. You need to be near the upper end of that threshold, because you need to be stimulating as much muscle growth as possible in that environment of no caloric surplus. And the other thing we come to with no caloric surplus, what do you have to have? You've got to have maximum muscle protein synthesis uptime. It also affects recovery and everything else. In other words, you need to be consuming lots of protein, and it needs to be spaced out. Otherwise, you are going to recomposition slower. In fact, you might find that you don't recomposition at all because you're not getting adequate muscle growth to offset the losses, to offset the breakdown from training, to offset the catabolism from training. And what ends up happening is that if you start doing silly stuff and you're not a total novice with no muscle mass, you start trying to recomp, particularly people at a healthy body fat who aren't novices. You try to recomp without dialing in your training perfectly, or you try to recomp while doing intermittent fasting and having a 5-hour or 6-hour feed window, or even an 8-hour every day, right? That's going to be a problem. You're just not going to recomposition. You're going to sit there and spin your wheels. And it's the same thing if you're bulking. Let's come over to the point of a calorie surplus. People who are trying to fast in a calorie surplus, are you kidding me? You're gaining less muscle because you're not getting total muscle protein synthesis uptime. So if you're gaining less muscle on the same caloric surplus, you're gaining more fat. You're going to get fat. That's what's going to happen. You're going to gain more fat and less muscle. It's ridiculous. Right? Intermittent fasting is largely a weight loss tool and a weight management tool. It is not a good recomposition tool. And it's definitely not a good muscle gaining tool, which that's what recomposition is gaining muscle while losing fat at the same time because you're staying near maintenance. And the people who cut on it, the people who successfully cut on intermittent fasting usually way protein overfeed, don't they? They dramatically protein overfeed, and they cut down oftentimes to minimalist training that gives them the most stimulus possible without being too difficult to recover from in a deficit, and that's usually the people who are successful on it. But they are eating enormous amounts of protein in that feed window just to preserve the muscle tissue that they are losing, or to rebuild some of the muscle they are losing during the fasted window. Because people need to understand that you are losing muscle during the fasted window. The growth hormone you are producing as a result of it does not preserve muscle tissue. It does not. All right, that is a losing battle. So my point is that intermittent fasting is a valuable fat loss tool. It is not a tool you want to utilize when you are attempting to legitimately, seriously recomposition or you want to gain muscle. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.